of weeks ago at Synod Assembly, Bishop Mark told us a cool story about a pastor around our area. And he noticed that a new family moved in right next door to the church. And so this pastor thought maybe he would be like one of those 70 who were sent out and go and be a missionary. The family moved in so close that the pastor joked he could watch their TV in their living room from his office. So after a while, he finally knocked on their door and introduced himself. So the pastor and the man who moved in visited for a while, and eventually the pastor invites the man to church. And the man says, "Pastor, I spend my entire week following rules at my job. There is no way I am going to spend my day off going to church following more rules." Well, at this point, I might have said, "Oh, okay, see you at the grocery store, I guess. Welcome to town." But to his credit, that pastor continued the conversation. He said, "Tell me more about your life. Tell me about this job of yours and the rules that you need to follow. What do you find is missing in your life? What are your struggles?" Well, the conversation blossomed from there. Those two men built up a relationship, and now, out of that conversation, there are talks about having a more informal worship service in the evening at that church with fewer rules. A really cool ministry came out of a conversation that maybe seemed a little difficult at first. Now imagine all of the other ways that this conversation could have gone. Maybe the pastor would have never even knocked on the man's door in the first place and just sort of thought, well, if he's interested, maybe he'll just come into church. Or the pastor could have left offended. The two men could have never really spoken much again. Or, even worse, they could have done like what the Galatians did and gotten into a big, huge argument about following the rules at church. But thank God that conversation continued, and something creative and positive was able to grow out of it. So Bishop Mark told us all this story, and then he said, one of the biggest things that all of us need to push ourselves to do is to speak with one another rather than about one another. Now, I don't mean the issue of gossiping, about somebody behind someone else's back, although there is that too. But what the bishop was really saying is that we need to speak not only with the people who are in church and come to church, but even people outside of the church, even people who might never even set foot inside of a church. We need to talk with newcomers. We need to talk with people who are different from us. So as we wrap up Paul's letter to the Galatians today, remember we've been reading through that whole book the last 6 weeks or so, and hooray, we finally made it to the end today. We remember that there are two very different groups of people, Gentiles and Jews, Greeks and Hebrews. And not only that, they are arguing over a very controversial issue for that time, the issue of circumcision. Their debate was, do you have to be circumcised or not? Do you have to follow a particular sexual rule or not in order to be a good Christian, in order to become part of the church? Paul concludes his letter that we just read from by trying to reconcile these two different groups of people with two very different opinions. Paul says that you're missing the point of Christianity if you're divided, if you're arguing over laws and customs and rules. Paul says there is no more circumcision or uncircumcision. That stuff doesn't matter because Jesus Christ has made a whole new creation. Paul says, and it's really quite simple actually, that life in Jesus Christ simply means to bear one another's burdens. Love your neighbor as yourself, and in this way, you're upholding the entire law. You don't need to worry about any of the other rules. If you're loving one another, all of your customs and traditions, all your differences and arguments don't matter anymore. Because Jesus Christ has brought us together in a new creation of love. Bear one another's burdens. Whenever you have the opportunity, work for the good of all. And in this way, you fulfill the entire law of Jesus Christ. It's as simple and as difficult as that. Now, I don't have a whole lot else to add to Paul's beautiful teaching, so I'm just going to make two simple observations that I noticed about the letter to the Galatians. Now, Paul has written many of the books of the New Testament, and they're all written to a different church in a different place, dealing with a different issue. Next week, I think we get to go on to the Ephesians, and then after that, Colossians and Romans, and we've got all of those books. And my first observation is that when you look at all of Paul's writings, they each tackle a different issue. The churches that Paul wrote to were concerned with the issue that was relevant to them. They were focused. They did not get distracted by what was going on in the next town over or in another state. They were aware of and informed about the issues in their own place, and they set their minds to resolving them. My second observation is just quite simply that even though these two groups were arguing, people were talking with one another, trying to work it out. So our acolyte can tell you that this past school year in confirmation, we were studying the Old Testament. Now, I wonder if you've ever thought about how many immigrants there are in the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments. In the New Testament, of course, we have Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And in the Old Testament, we have, of course, Abraham and Sarah, and, well, all of the Israelites. You see, the Bible is filled with stories of people moving around, going from place to place and leaving their homeland. Well, I learned quite quickly that in order to hold the attention of 25 middle schoolers, I needed to make these Bible stories relevant for their lives today. So I was always trying to think of something creative and exciting to do in order to teach the Old Testament. One day it just kind of dawned on me to ask Marichelle to speak with our confirmation students and to simply tell us about her life. Marichelle is a wonderful woman who works as the treasurer and secretary of our congregation, and her office is just a few doors down from mine. And I have to tell you, when I first went to her and asked her if she would help me teach our confirmation students, I was kind of embarrassed because I had been working with her for many, many months. I had been passing by her office every day. She's the only colleague I have who I'm not married to. And I realized that I didn't even know her story about moving from Mexico up here to North Dakota. Luckily, Marichelle is a very forgiving woman and was very happy to share her story with me and with us. And when she came to our confirmation class, I have never seen 25 middle schoolers more quiet and respectful. They were totally engrossed in hearing her fascinating story, and I was so touched, both by her story and by how respectful and interested our kids were to learn about somebody who was different from them. One of the reasons I love having youth in our congregation is because often they truly are our best teachers. You might have heard that the youth group up from Powers Lake just went on a mission trip to New York City. They just got back about a week ago. And for them, one of the most powerful lessons from the whole trip was the experience that they had of living with diverse people who were different from them. You see, they stayed in and served neighborhoods in the South Bronx and in Brooklyn that were immigrant communities, and communities that were also primarily African American. One of the young men on that trip who had just graduated high school up in Powers Lake said, I think that was the first time in my life ever where I looked around and not everybody looked like me. And better yet, he spoke about what a positive experience that was and how powerful that was for him. I'm told that the Sunday after they got back from that trip, the youth were in charge of preaching and leading the worship service. And they got up in front of the church and they said, diversity was one of the most beautiful gifts and experiences that we had that entire time. And we really, all of us, need to work a little harder to get to know people who are different. So that's kind of a challenge for me. And I don't know if it's a challenge for you too, but let us take on that challenge together. Sometimes I think about my own European immigrant ancestors and how they once were outsiders and how hopefully somebody was kind enough to show them some compassion and some welcome. And so let us honor their struggle by having compassion and not judgment for those in our midst, for those who are coming to Stanley now, who might be outsiders for us, who might feel a little different for us. You see, the power of Jesus brings people together. Now, I realize that differences are not always easy to overcome. I realize that each one of us probably has a little bit of sheep and a little bit of wolf inside of us. We might have questions and opinions and attitudes maybe about whole groups of people, whether that be a racial difference or a sexual difference or a religious difference. But Jesus has the power to bring together even Jews and Gentiles. That's almost hard as Vikings fans and Packers fans. So together, let us take up that challenge that Bishop Mark gives to us, that the youth of Powers Lake give to us, that Jesus and Paul give to us. Maybe there's a group of people out there that we could do a little bit of a better job talking with, learning their story, simply listening to them without judgment. So maybe we can all up and take a trip to New York City. Or maybe we can have a conversation with somebody who is in the room today. We can always learn someone else's story and talk with someone. You see, we are called, but we are also privileged to have the responsibility of loving our neighbor, bearing one another's burdens. And so in order to do that, we must get to know our neighbors and learn what their burdens are. And who is my neighbor? Cliffhanger. In our gospel story next week, somebody asks Jesus this very question: who is my neighbor? And he gives the most politically incorrect, scandalous, surprising, offensive answer. It's so shocking, in fact, that left to our own devices, we never possibly could love our neighbors because of who they are. We all would fail. But friends, with Jesus, the most awesome and impossible things become possible. Amen.